There was a quiet rhythm to life in Willow Creek, the kind of rhythm that doesn't demand much, only asks that you keep moving forward one calm step at a time. My name is Claire Bennett, and for nearly a decade I had done just that. I filled my days with quiet rituals. Morning coffee brewed just before sunrise, a slow walk to the garden where hydrangeas leaned into the sun, dinner simmering on the stove before the porch lights flickered on at dusk. It was a peaceful life, orderly, undisturbed, and in many ways invisible. My husband, Daniel, had always been dedicated, reliable, steady. A man who loved his work more loudly than he ever expressed his affection. He never strayed, never shouted, never gave me a reason to doubt him. But love doesn't always fade with drama. Sometimes it just goes silent. So when Ethan came to stay, a temporary arrangement just until his transfer to another city processed, I didn't expect his presence to shift anything. He was Daniel's stepson from his first marriage, someone I'd only seen occasionally at holidays, grown into a quiet man who carried himself with a kind of still confidence. At first, our interactions were nothing more than polite. The occasional exchange in the kitchen, a passing good morning. But then came the glances, those small, barely there moments. The ones I told myself I had imagined. Once I caught him watching me stir honey into my tea. Not staring exactly, just observing, as if something about the movement held meaning. I felt it, a flicker of awareness, and dismissed it almost instantly. But then I began to notice the way he moved. How his footsteps were softer in the hallway when he knew I was nearby. How he lingered longer in rooms I entered. How he paused before speaking, as though measuring his words more carefully than necessary. And something inside me, something I thought I had folded away with age and practicality, stirred. It wasn't desire. Not at first. It was something quieter, more elusive. A ripple beneath the surface of my otherwise calm life. An awareness of being noticed, of being seen. It had been a long time since anyone really saw me. Daniel was still the same. Present in body, absent in spirit. Our conversations had become transactional. Grocery lists, appointment reminders, weekend plans that neither of us truly looked forward to. I couldn't remember the last time he had asked how I was, not just in passing, but with the patience to really hear the answer. So I told myself that the small, strange flutter I felt when Ethan entered the room was nothing. Passing thought. A brief lapse of sense. But thoughts, even the smallest ones, have roots. And sometimes they grow quietly, beneath the surface, beneath the ordinary. Looking back, I realized the shift didn't happen in one moment. It happened in 1,000 tiny ones. In the pause between words. In the silence after a glance. In the warmth of attention I never knew I missed, until it returned. And that's the thing about change. It rarely arrives with thunder. Sometimes it slips through the cracks like sunlight at dawn. So soft you don't notice until it has already warmed the room. There's something unnerving about realizing someone sees you. Not just in passing, but truly sees you. It was subtle at first. Ethan would pass through the kitchen as I made my morning coffee. A casual presence, unhurried, calm. He never interrupted. Sometimes he'd offer to rinse a cup. Other times he'd simply stand by the window, his arms folded, eyes on the trees swaying outside. We didn't speak much in those moments, and yet, the silence carried weight. He had a way of being still without feeling idle. Like he was present in a way that most people forget how to be. I began to notice how attuned he was, not just to the house but to me. If I dropped a spoon, he was already reaching down before I did. If I paused while reading a recipe aloud to myself, he'd quietly hand me the next ingredient. These weren't grand gestures. They were barely even noticeable. But they happened often enough to leave an impression. One afternoon, Daniel called from the office. Another late night. I stood by the sink after I hung up, staring out into the backyard. The garden lights had just flickered on, casting soft shadows across the porch. I wasn't upset. I'd grown used to the solitude. But there was a heaviness in my chest all the same. An ache that came not from what was said, but from what was always missing. "You're not surprised," a voice said quietly behind me. I turned startled. Ethan stood in the doorway. His arms were crossed loosely, his expression unreadable, almost gentle. "I'm not," I said. "Daniel, he's married to his work. He always has been." He didn't respond right away. He just looked at me like he was trying to understand something. I wasn't sure I even understood myself. Then he smiled, soft, almost sad. "That's a shame." I should have brushed it off, laughed maybe, or changed the subject. But instead I felt a warmth rise to my face. Not embarrassment, something more vulnerable. As though his words had touched a place inside me I had been trying to ignore. "You shouldn't say things like that," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "Why not?" he asked gently, taking a step closer. "Is it wrong to notice what's been left unspoken?" The air between us shifted, subtly but undeniably. I felt it in my breath, in the stillness of the room. I turned away, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter. I needed to ground myself, to hold on to something real, something solid. This wasn't a moment. It couldn't be. I wouldn't let it become one. "You should go out tonight," I said, forcing my voice into something casual. "See your friends. Take a break." He didn't move. I felt his gaze lingering, felt the pause stretch into something I couldn't name. "I'm having a good time right here," he said softly. My breath caught. There was no playfulness in his tone. "No teasing. Just calm honesty." And something else, something quiet but electric, like a current just beneath the surface. I didn't answer. I couldn't. So he added, almost in a whisper, "But you should know something." I turned to look at him, and for the first time there was no trace of a smile. His expression was steady, clear. His eyes met mine with startling intensity. "I don't think I want to stop noticing." The room felt smaller, like the walls had moved closer without a sound. My pulse thudded in my ears, but I kept still. I didn't step forward. I didn't step back. I just stood there, seen, and strangely understood. There's a certain kind of silence that follows you, not because it's unwelcome, but because it remembers everything. After that moment in the kitchen with Ethan, I found myself moving through the house with more deliberation. My steps were quieter, my thoughts heavier. I kept busy, reorganizing drawers that didn't need organizing, calling old friends I hadn't spoken to in months, even cleaning the baseboards. But none of it was about cleanliness or connection. It was avoidance. Plain and simple. Avoidance wears many masks: productivity, politeness, pretense. I wore all three like armor. When Daniel came home late again that week, I didn't even ask how his day had gone. He kissed my cheek out of habit. I smiled out of reflex. We moved around each other like dancers who'd long forgotten the music, and yet I could still feel it. The quiet hum of something unspoken lingering between me and Ethan. I wasn't chasing it, but I wasn't chasing it away either. One evening, unable to sleep, I stepped outside. The wind had a softness to it, the kind that only exists just before summer fully arrives. The sky was bruised with the last traces of twilight, and the garden lights flickered lazily. That's when I saw him, Ethan, He was in the backyard, barefoot on the patio stones, his shirt discarded on the chair beside him. His skin caught the golden light, and he moved with a kind of focus I'd never noticed before. Each stretch deliberate, each breath controlled. He wasn't showing off. It didn't feel like that. But he also wasn't unaware. I should have turned around. It would have been easy just a few steps back through the door. But I didn't. I stayed. I watched. He slowed when he noticed me. I could tell by the way his movements shifted. More fluid, more drawn out, like time had momentarily bent for us. "You don't have to hide," he said gently, reaching for a towel. I startled at the sound of his voice, though it wasn't loud. It was grounding, calm, like he already knew I wouldn't run this time. "I wasn't hiding," I replied quietly. He stepped closer, not intrusively, just enough to close the space without demanding anything. "No?" he asked, voice low. "Then why do you keep running from what you feel?" I swallowed. My hands fidgeted with the hem of my sweater. "This isn't a game, Ethan. I never thought it was." There was no heat in his voice, no pressure, only a quiet certainty that disarmed me more than any bold declaration could. I should have said something final. I should have broken whatever thread had begun to tie us together in these moments of silence and breath. But instead I stood still, listening to the quiet sound of my own pulse. He reached for my hand, not fully, not forcefully, just the softest brush of his fingers against mine. It was barely a touch, and yet it reached places I thought I'd forgotten how to feel. My breath stilled. My body, confused by its own betrayal, didn't recoil. "You feel it too," he said softly, like he was naming a truth that had always been there, just waiting to be heard aloud. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. Above us, clouds thickened. A low rumble stretched across the horizon, like the sky itself was holding its breath. And when the first raindrops began to fall, I finally stepped back, just enough to remind myself that I still could. "This can't happen," I whispered, though even I wasn't sure if it was a warning or a wish. He didn't argue. He didn't need to. The look in his eyes said everything. It already had. The night after the rain, everything felt unusually still. Willow Creek had a way of quieting down after storms, as if even the trees needed time to settle back into their roots. The air was damp, cool, and fragrant with earth and wet leaves. Inside the house, the lights flickered gently, the hum of the refrigerator louder than usual in the calm. I hadn't spoken to Ethan since the moment in the backyard. We passed each other occasionally, his footsteps soft on the stairs, mine deliberate down the hallway. There were no words, just awareness, the kind that lives beneath the surface of routine. The next morning I woke before sunrise. I moved quietly through the kitchen, the kettle heating, the sky still in shades of pale blue and silver. I thought I was alone until I turned and saw him already there, leaning against the counter watching me. Neither of us said anything at first. There was no tension, only a kind of waiting, like we both knew the air had changed, but neither of us wanted to breathe too deeply just yet. "You didn't walk away this time," he finally said, his voice low, almost thoughtful. I tried to steady myself. "There's nothing to walk away from." A slow smile ghosted his lips. "Are you sure about that?" I wanted to say yes. I wanted to deny the soft tremble in my fingers as I poured the tea, to brush away the way his gaze lingered just long enough to feel like touch. But the lie caught in my throat and I said nothing. He moved quietly, just enough to brush past me, reaching for the coffee pot. His hand grazed my waist. It could have been innocent. It wasn't. The contact was brief, barely noticeable, but it bloomed through me like warmth spreading beneath skin too long untouched. I froze not because I was afraid, but because I realized how easy it would be to fall. He leaned in slightly. Not enough to trap, just enough to tempt. "You keep saying this can't happen," he whispered. "But you never say you don't want it to." I inhaled slowly, the breath catching like wind in a curtain. I should have denied it. Should have stepped back. Should have laughed, scolded, redirected. But I didn't. I stood there, quiet, open, afraid of how true his words felt. And then the sky answered for me. A sudden clap of thunder rolled through the clouds, loud and lingering. The lights blinked once, then dimmed. Rain began again, steady against the windows. The storm had returned, outside and within me. In the muted light, he reached for my wrist, his fingers wrapping around it not with force, but with a kind of reverence. A question without words. A space for me to decide. I looked at him then, really looked. His eyes didn't demand, they invited. They asked only for honesty. And when he leaned in, his lips brushing mine with the gentleness of breath, I let them stay. I let it happen. There was no drama in the kiss. No wild hunger. Just a slow unraveling. Warmth. Familiarity that had never been named. The faint taste of coffee, the scent of rain, the quiet knowing between us. His hands found my waist. Mine rested against his chest. And in that space where so much had once been absent, I felt full seen, heard, held. I didn't care what it meant. I didn't care what line we were crossing. All I knew was that, for the first time in a long, long time, I felt awake. The hours after that morning felt unreal, as if the house itself had softened, its walls less rigid, its silence less cold. And yet, beneath the stillness, I could feel it. A slow shift in gravity. Something sacred had been disturbed. Not shattered, not destroyed, but undeniably changed. I didn't regret it. That was the hardest part to admit to myself. I had always thought that crossing a line like that would come with instant remorse. A flood of shame, a desperate need to undo. But what I felt wasn't shame. It was stillness. As though a noise that had been humming inside me for years had finally gone quiet. Ethan didn't speak of it. He didn't corner me with questions or linger with expectation. He moved through the house the same way he always had, quiet, respectful, present. But something in the way he looked at me had changed. Softer, more certain, and I was different too. I walked through the rooms with an awareness that hadn't been there before. Not of guilt, but of closeness. Of knowing someone had seen a part of me I had long kept hidden, even from myself. We didn't speak of what had passed between us. We didn't need to. It lived in the pauses, in the way his fingers brushed mine when we reached for the same dish, in the soft glances over coffee, in the quiet recognition of something we were still afraid to name, but wanting even when gentle always comes with weight. Daniel noticed the difference first. Not in what I said or did, but in the way I seemed lighter. Not happier necessarily, just changed. Present in ways I hadn't been before. As though a fog had lifted, and I was now standing somewhere brighter. "Everything okay?" he asked one evening, his voice casual, distracted as always. "Yes," I replied, and for the first time, the word felt neither honest nor dishonest. Simply was. Daniel didn't push. He rarely did. And that was the problem, wasn't it? We had grown so used to not asking, to not noticing, that even the silence between us had become routine. But with Ethan, silence wasn't an absence. It was a conversation. I found myself craving the spaces we created together. Those moments of stillness that felt more intimate than touch. Moments where I could simply exist and be noticed for it. And yet, I knew what we were doing lived in a fragile world. A hidden one. A world that couldn't last, not without cost. The cost hadn't arrived yet, but I could feel it breathing down the back of my neck. Soft, steady, patient. There was a night, not long after, when I woke in the dark and reached for the edge of the bed without thinking. It was a movement born of instinct, a search for something I didn't fully understand. My hand met nothing but cool sheets. I lay there staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft rain tapping the windows. The ache in my chest wasn't regret. It was longing, longing for something that made me feel alive again. Longing for the impossible safety of something that was never meant to be safe. I knew this couldn't go on, that secrets like these eventually ask to be spoken, or are forced into the light. But I also knew something else, something more dangerous. I didn't want to stop. Not yet. Secrets are like whispers in an empty room. They echo. Sometimes softly, sometimes loud enough to shatter everything. I had thought we were careful, that the quiet nature of what existed between Ethan and me made it invisible. That if we kept it tucked in the small, unlit corners of our days, it would never demand to be seen. But secrets don't stay in the dark forever. Daniel began noticing little things. The shift wasn't dramatic. He was never the confrontational type, but his glances lingered a bit longer. His questions were more frequent, though still wrapped in politeness. He wasn't suspicious. Not yet. Just aware. I convinced myself it was nothing. That if I just stayed steady, smiled at the right time, answered without delay, it would pass. But one evening everything changed. The rain had just stopped, leaving a silver sheen across the patio. I was in the kitchen, wiping down the counter, my thoughts elsewhere. On Ethan, on the last time we'd brushed hands by the coffee pot, on the way his eyes softened when I said his name without meaning to. The front door opened. Too early. Daniel stepped inside, his shoes damp, his coat slung carelessly over one arm. I turned sharply, heart thudding, hands still damp with the dishcloth I hadn't realized I was holding so tightly. He didn't say hello. He didn't smile. He just stood there for a moment, eyes studying me, searching for something he couldn't quite name. Then he asked, "Where is he?" The words hung in the air. Not angry, not loud, but heavy. Intentional. I froze. Who? His jaw tightened. You know who. The stillness in the room turned thick. I could hear the faint ticking of the wall clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft stir of wind brushing against the window panes. I glanced only for a second toward the hallway. A small movement, barely perceptible. But Daniel saw it, and in that glance, he found all the answers he hadn't wanted to know. "You've been different lately," he said, quieter now. His voice carried no blame, only distance. Not in an obvious way. Just quieter in some places, louder in others. I forced a soft laugh, though my throat was dry. "You're overthinking." He tilted his head slightly, as if examining the pieces of me, trying to fit them back into a shape he once understood. "Am I?" His eyes searched mine. I looked away. There was no accusation in his voice, just something that hurt more deeply, resignation. Then came the silence, the kind of silence that speaks louder than any confrontation, the kind that confirms everything that's gone unsaid. Daniel took a step back. His shoulders dropped. He exhaled, sharp, quiet. His fingers curled slightly at his sides before he let them fall loose again. "I don't need to hear it," he said, voice barely above a whisper. "I already know." He turned and walked away, the sound of his footsteps muted against the floorboards. A moment later, the front door shut behind him, not slammed but firm. I stood there in the quiet, still holding the damp cloth in my hands, the counter now long wiped clean. I should have felt relief. That he hadn't demanded the truth. That he hadn't raised his voice or made a scene. But all I felt was the hollow weight of what had just fallen apart. What had been mine, quiet, stable, familiar, was now broken. And the worst part? I wasn't sure I wanted to pick it back up. After Daniel left that evening, the house fell into a different kind of silence. Not the peaceful kind I had once cherished, the kind filled with garden breezes and the soft clink of teacups. No, this was a silence with weight. With edges, a silence that knew. I stood in the kitchen long after the door closed, unsure whether to sit or move or breathe. The scent of lemon cleaner still lingered faintly in the air, a strange contrast to the rawness of everything else. In the corner of the room, the wind pressed gently against the window panes, almost as if the house itself was exhaling for me. I didn't cry. Not yet. I think some part of me was still holding back, still caught between the person I had always tried to be and the woman who had just let everything unravel. Ethan didn't appear. He didn't come to the doorway, didn't follow me up the stairs. And somehow that absence felt like the only kindness left in the night. I went to bed alone, though the bed didn't feel much different. It hadn't been truly shared in a long time. Not in the ways that mattered. Sleep didn't come. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ethan's hand near mine. I heard Daniel's voice, too calm, too resigned. I remembered the softness of Ethan's touch, the sorrow in Daniel's retreat, the storm outside that seemed to mirror the one within me. By morning, the rain had stopped. I walked downstairs to find the house just as I had left it. Nothing out of place, everything painfully in order. Ethan was already there, sitting by the kitchen window, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He looked up as I entered, but he didn't smile. He didn't need to. There was something in his eyes that said he already knew what had happened. Or maybe he'd known it would happen all along. He didn't speak. Neither did I. I poured my tea slowly, trying to steady my hands, trying to pretend the world hadn't shifted on its axis. "You okay?" he finally asked, voice low, careful. I nodded, then shook my head. "I don't know," I whispered. He looked down at his cup, as if searching for the right words inside the swirl of steam. "What now?" he asked quietly. And the truth was, I didn't know. What do you do after everything breaks open? After the truth sits quietly between you and refuses to be buried again? I didn't answer. I couldn't, so I sat across from him, the table between us, 2 mugs growing cold. Outside, the sky was beginning to clear, but inside, the weight hadn't lifted. I didn't know where we would go from here, if anywhere. I didn't know what would become of my marriage, or the woman I thought I was before all of this began. But I did know one thing, as clearly as I knew the color of the morning light on the windowsill. Sometimes the greatest ache isn't in losing what you had. It's in realizing you had already lost it long before you ever reached for something else. Life in Willow Creek went on. The garden still bloomed. The morning tea still steeped in silence. The house, though quieter now, still held its shape, unchanged in form but not in memory. I don't know what the future holds. I only know that love isn't always loud, and loss isn't always sudden. Sometimes they arrive softly. Sometimes they leave without slamming the door. And sometimes they echo long after the moment has passed. But I'm learning to live with the echo, not to chase it, not to quiet it, just to let it be. This story is a fictional narrative created for storytelling purposes only. It explores themes of emotional complexity, loneliness, and internal conflict. It is not intended to encourage or romanticize infidelity or inappropriate relationships. Viewer discretion is advised.